Then we'll get started. Excellent. Perfect. So thank you everybody for joining us today. It's a great pleasure. I'm the co-coordinator of the research on interdisciplinary global studies here at Montclair State University. And it's a great pleasure to really introduce today's panel on making ends meet in a state of crisis, comparing policy responses. And this virtual roundtable was sort of at the origin of Bernard, Leon Reis, who will moderate the session today. And he hails from Sciences Po, but he has very many hats. He's also the director of the Future Policy Lab in Spain. We have also a representative here. I think Jorge, right? You work with Bernard on these issues, and I'm very, very pleased to have this esteemed audience and the participants on from different think tanks, including here in the US, the Center for American Progress, and then LSE Ideas in the UK, as well as the Future Policy Lab, as I mentioned, and then last but not least, Marc-Olivier with Terra Nova. But the idea is really to spark a conversation on how sort of government policies are key here for the future of our societies, and Bernard will certainly be able to sort of shuttle us through and compare and contrast some of these things, and it just fits so nicely with this network that we have here at Montclair State University, the second largest public university in the state of New Jersey, and it's a very driven university. We're a Hispanic servant institution, and so this idea of social mobility is also big, and so there might be questions that you also address in terms of that as well. But with regards to RIGS, so we have over 40 scholars in this network, and the idea is really to use this interdisciplinary, sometimes also transversal approach to provide opportunities for collaborations, research support, and sort of research sharing. And so we really want to highlight this interconnectedness that happens globally, but also locally. And we really promote faculty scholarship and showcase sort of the expertise that we have within the campus, but also certainly beyond. And this is a great example. And again, I'm so glad that you guys were able to make it today. It's a very busy time. And I'm also very, very grateful for our participants or audience that joined us in this webinar today, because it's crunch season. Rose mentioned earlier, in the think tank world, everyone tries to get everything done the last minute. I mean, it's the end of the semester frenzy here. So I think we're all in the same boat. And so I really am very, very grateful that we all got together today. And without further ado, I'll open up the floor to Bernard Leon Reis, who will moderate the session. And again, thank you so much to everyone for being here, participants and audience. Floor is all yours.
Thanks so much, Arnaud, for this very generous introduction. So today we are going to speak about the cost of living crisis, and we're going to do it in a way that I think that has been rarely explored in the past few months, which is sort of comparing the responses of different governments to this cost of living crisis, and putting together some thoughts on how to improve this response from representatives of some of the most important think tanks of each of the countries represented here. So we have Rose Qatar, who's at the Center for American Progress, Associate Director of the Economic Analysis team. Rose holds a master's from the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy, and will be responding to these questions in relation to the US case. We have Marc-Olivier Padis, who's Director of Studies of the French think tank Terra Nova, who will be speaking about the French case. We have Jorge Tamames, who's a doctoral researcher at University College Dublin, a teacher at Sciences Po, and a fellow of Future Policy Lab, Spanish think tank focused on public policy, and Stephen Paduano, who's been a UN consultant until a few days ago, if I'm not wrong, Steve, that you finished your tenure at the UN, executive director of the LSE Global Economic Governance Commission, and a doctoral researcher at that university, and he'll be speaking about the British case. So without further ado, I'd like to explain very quickly to the participants and the public how we will structure today's conversation. We will first ask a common question to all speakers, basically to explain in a few minutes the response of their government to this cost of living crisis and how they assess this response, each of them speaking from their own institutions, the respective think tanks. And then after that first round, we will have a second common question where we will try to explore what way forward, or in other words, what should the policy priorities be in the opinion of our speakers from now on, the objective of their governments once again. From there, we will probably open the floor to questions, and at the same time, we'll try to have a conversation perhaps between the panelists, trying to draw on what they all bring to this debate. So yeah, without further ado, because I know that some of the panelists will have to leave a bit earlier, I think, Rose, we can start with you. If that's fine, then we can move on to Marc-Olivier, then to Jorge, and then to Steve. Rose, yeah, in around 5 minutes, more or less, how would you summarize the response of the US government to this cost of living crisis, and how do you assess, and what is more broadly like perhaps the assessment that the Center for American Progress, of course, like probably the main reference in terms of progressive public policy in the country. Yeah, how would you assess this response from the Biden administration?
Thanks so much. I think something I just want to start very briefly with is some context, particularly because we got new inflation data on Tuesday in the US, and we've basically seen some initial signs that inflation is cooling, and it's down from its highest levels earlier this year. We saw monthly inflation was like 0.1% here, down from 0.4% in September and October. I'm obviously talking about headline inflation there, but core inflation is also trending downwards. And I just want to set out that, there is some good news that inflation is headed in the right direction. But at the same time, I think we really need to level set and be honest that, inflation really is crippling families. And it's very clear to us that the Biden administration has made, inflation their top domestic priority for that very reason. And so something that sometimes gets missed in the US media landscape is that, inflation is a global issue. Clearly, it is a global issue. We're all talking about this from different parts of the world. And the causes of inflation are very similar, like across the world. We see Russia's war in Ukraine, the ongoing economic repercussions of the pandemic, and supply chain bottlenecks. And I start with that because I think, that context and those causes really limit then what are the options for governments to do in terms of how do they respond to inflation. Obviously, historically, inflation has been in the realm of monetary policy. We've traditionally just left it to central banks to do their thing. And the administration has basically done the same thing. The Fed has been increasing interest rates at an unprecedented and rapid pace. Just yesterday, we saw the Federal Reserve again announce another interest rate hike. It slowed. They went from 75 basis points to 50 basis points. But they made very clear yesterday that we will see some more interest rate hikes moving forward in 2023. Now, at the same time, the administration's view in terms of how do we respond through the realm of fiscal policy has been, look, we need to create policy understanding the landscape of inflation, which means we're not doing anything that's going to make the situation worse, which is a really important principle to hold. But in addition, and something that particularly is unique to the US has been, this inflation crisis is a sign of what's happened at the times now, but the US has faced a decades-long affordability crisis. Wages have been stagnant for decades, and many things like housing and childcare and healthcare and energy have long been out of reach for households. And so the administration's kind of taken that approach. And so they've done the things that we've all talked about in terms of, okay, there are supply chain bottlenecks. They've worked to fix those supply chain bottlenecks, with the limits of what they can do in terms of fiscal policy, but they've also taken a bit of a broader approach to what does cost of living crisis mean. So they've tackled things like we want to reduce the cost of, non-negotiable expenses, things that were expensive with or without inflation. So I'm thinking about some of their reforms in terms of prescription drug reforms, healthcare reforms, and energy costs. And so there was a bill that passed earlier this year called the Inflation Reduction Act, which was kind of their main response to bringing down, cost of living. They've also done things like strengthening the nation's supply chain through investing in domestic manufacturing, expanding the capacity of ports and waterways, all of those things to keep, shelves stocked and prices down. And that was extremely critical very early on. Something we've been really struggling with here, and so too have our counterparts in Europe, has been an energy crisis. And so what the United States has really done is the administration has released more than 180 million barrels of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve so far. That's accounting for approximately 75% of global releases since March. That's a really big number. And they're doing that with the sole purpose of increasing supply and keeping prices down. And we're seeing the effects of that already taking place. Gas prices have been steadily declining. They're now at their lowest level in more than a year. The most common price at gas stations is around $2.99. And so that's all very welcome news and really important relief to families. So the thing I just want to close with is basically saying the administration has, done the right thing by letting the Federal Reserve do what it's meant to do. I'll talk a little bit more in the second part about my thoughts on what the Federal Reserve can and cannot do. But the other thing to really keep in mind is the administration's actions have given the Fed leeway to move cautiously. Nothing they've really done has been to add on to inflation. What they've been trying to do is pursue what they're calling an industrial strategy with the aim of, reducing the cost of living in the best way that they can do with fiscal policy.
Thanks so much, Rose, for this first remark, focusing so much on offer supply solutions to this problem of inflation. Perhaps Marc-Olivier, if you want to take it from here, like how would you describe and assess the response of Macron's administration to this cost of living crisis, which of course has many peculiarities in the French case?
Yes, thank you for your invitation. The French analysis of the situation is that the inflation comes mainly from the energy crisis, and that means from the war in Ukraine, of course. And as Rose said, there was before the supply chain problem post-pandemic, of course, that started a bit the inflation, but it's really a matter coming from the energy prices. So the answer of the government was completely focused on energy prices, and they had several means to act on that. So, as Rose said, normally it's the job of the central bank to find the good rate of inflation, but maybe because of the pandemic, President Macron said, whatever it takes, we will deal with that. So there's really for the French people, the idea that the government is able to react when a situation as this comes. So they decided to limit the price of electricity. They asked EDF, our main electric company, to limit its prices for households. And they decided to create a tariff shield for energy prices for households and for companies. And they limited also gasoline prices at the pump, really when you come with your car. So that had that was really effective, because inflation is a bit lower in France than in the rest of Europe. It's around 6% for this year. So it worked, but it's very expensive, because only in 22 it costed 24 billion euros, this tariff shield. So now they are discussing and also they are discussing something different, because there are also two or maybe three main problems with this kind of action. The first one is that it's not targeted on people who most need a protection against inflation. For example, you have to know that in France, minimum wages and minimum pensions are indexed on the inflation. This means that the lower wages are protected against inflation, and that the cost of living is rather a problem for middle class people. So it's a very specific political problem, because you have to address with this problem for the middle class. The second point is that so if you do not target your tariff shield, of course you spend more. And the third problem is that you don't put any incentive on reducing the consumption of energy. And of course, because of the objectives about climate change, we have to limit the use of gas energy and so on. And so you do not give the right incentive if you do not work on prices. So there is a lot of discussion because of these limits of this politics. And so we'll see that in the second round, there are new measures that are discussed right now.
Thanks so much, Marc-Olivier. So, Jorge, how would you describe the response that the center-left coalition of PSOE and Podemos has put forward vis-a-vis the inflation crisis in Spain?
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so as Berna was already touching upon, there's a couple of things that are worth taking into consideration before looking at the actual policies that the Spanish government has put in place. The first is that this is sort of a novel government that is a coalition, right, between the traditional center-left party and a sort of left populist party coalition, Unidas Podemos. So this is a sort of novel experiment in contemporary Spanish history. Coalition governments were not that frequent until now. In fact, there are no precedents at the national level. And then there's also the question that, of course, a lot of the measures that have been undertaken overlap with measures that were taken previously in the context of the COVID crisis, right, to sort of ease the burden on families and companies. And so, we had things that are typical to other European countries, like work furloughs. We also had a labor law reform to try and reduce temporality in the labor market. There was a minimum allowance scheme for families and individuals. All of these were approved before the present crisis, right? But they've helped mitigate the crisis right now. But in terms of managing energy prices, the government was also caught in sort of a very delicate position. Spain is not very much exposed to the supply of Russian gas, and I should mention, sort of like Marc emphasized, that for Europe this is not sort of a demand-driven inflation shock in a way that it is slightly for the United States, right? So what we face more so than inflation is actually price shocks in specific sectors, more particularly the energy sector. So much so that, in fact, when you look at wages are not following the inflation pattern. So it's even not that accurate to talk about an inflationary spiral of any sort, right? And that means that we are also limited in terms of addressing this problem through the traditional tool of interest rates. That's a sort of clumsy one-size-fits-all approach that also presents a series of problems within the Eurozone, right, in terms of fiscal fragmentation and whatnot. So instead, the focus has been on trying to manage prices through this mechanism that is called the Iberian exception, which is essentially a sort of price cap on the gas that is used for energy generation. Now, I should mention that this policy was sort of like viewed as too heterodox about a year ago. Now it's sort of becoming part of the mainstream options, right? So the menu of policies that are available for governments across the EU. The government did not reach it immediately. So originally it improvised a bit. It tried to sort of like, lowering the value-added tax on gas, lowering the price of gas at the pump, like Marc was mentioning. Of course, these measures really don't disincentivize consumption. So they're really, they can ease the burden, but they don't really provide a structural solution to the structural to the energy crisis that Europe faces. So what this price cap does is essentially, because Spain and Portugal, right, and the Iberian Peninsula are isolated from the European energy markets. So that's the sort of justification. What it does is it establishes a limit of 40 euros per megawatt hour for the gas that's bought at the spot market, right? And so basically, the companies are then compensated, right? And consumers pay for a small compensation of the companies that have to provide gas that is also at higher prices anyway. But what this does is like it allows you to leapfrog to the sort of like higher margins that are generated at the spot market. So much so that Spain right now, you know, in recent weeks is paying, I think, around slightly under 100 euros per megawatt hour for, and in some countries in Europe, that's 4 times the price right now, right? And this is making a huge difference in terms of the consumer price index. So I should mention, I mean, this is for the time being a policy success story, right? Spain right now has one of the lowest consumer price indexes in the EU. It's currently below 7%, which gives an idea that if you manage to control energy prices at the EU level, most of the inflation story, right, is addressed, right? There's still some problems in food markets and whatnot, and inflation expectations, but so far this has been a relative success. And I should add that the country after Spain that has also managed to control these prices is France, right? Through having sort of a partly nationalized sector and being able to control prices in a more direct way. So, you know, hopefully this will, you know, incentivize other European countries to contemplate these sort of options. Price controls a year ago were considered an overly radical measure in the context of the crisis we face, but I think more and more they're becoming part of a range of policies that is useful to use in the context of the energy price spikes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jorge. This is perhaps something that we can discuss in the debate later on, this option of controlling prices directly. Steve, how would you, I mean, this is a very difficult question, I reckon, to assess the response of the administration, the British administration to this cost of living crisis, because you could just answer which one, right? But I'm gonna trust that you can summarize and assess this response of these different cabinets.
Yeah, no, it's been uplifting hearing about the relatively benign political and economic conditions in other countries compared to the United Kingdom in recent months. So the UK, just in the past couple of days, the Office for Budget Responsibility has released that the UK is in recession, and they projected that recession to last all through next year. Inflation has broken a bit. It was it hit a 40-year high last month. It's now closer to a 30-year high. It's down from 11.1% to 10.7 or something like this. I think that there are sort of 3 interesting responses to look at over here. And like what we're seeing in other parts of the world, this is also largely energy driven. Electricity prices have gone up 65% this year. I mean, it's pretty remarkable for households. Energy prices are looking at up to 90% was another report from the Office for National Statistics, and that's different for the corporate sector. But so the three big responses on the table. There's the headline one, which is making news today, which is industrial action. There are large strikes happening around the United Kingdom. Today is in fact the first strike for NHS workers in the history of the NHS. So, you know, it's not, industrial action has not reached the level of the 1970s. That was much different. That was much more severe, and I mean, it perhaps could, but it's unlikely to in my expectation. But we're certainly seeing a level of industrial action that isn't quite like anything that we saw in prior bad periods, the university strikes a decade or so ago. So that's one. That's what's grabbing the headlines at the moment. The second is the monetary policy response, which is certainly very important. Yesterday, the Bank of England raised rates by 50 basis points, which, I mean, there are very few abstentions to that. I think that the sense, not just by the Bank of England, but by everybody, is that interest rates will have to continue to rise, and that while inflation is slowing over here in other parts of the world, that the monetary policy path is going to remain pretty tight in the coming months. And then Thirdly, there has been some relief. There have been 2 rounds of cost of living crisis payments. That's been moderately counteracted by the fact that they've let the cap on energy bills for households rise from £2,500 a month to 3,000. So it's mixed. These are also all targeted for the lowest income households. So that's calibrated based on your eligibility to other things like unemployment insurance, job seekers allowance, pension credits, child tax credits, etc. So what we're looking at in the United Kingdom is, I think, a fairly disaggregated response that's so far quite in response to the politics of the nature, as Berna referenced. There has been frequent regime change in the past year, also caught up in this inflation crisis, and the expectation is that this policy response will continue to change as well. With respect to the strikes, the government has been staring down the unions, waiting for either side to crack, and that comes more down to a political assessment than an economic assessment, which is when does public opinion turn and against whom? And the sense is that there's a lot of public sympathy for the NHS workers, particularly after the 2 years of a pandemic. Whether that sympathy will last in the coming months, whether that will extend to other rail strikes, tube strikes, border guard strikes, that's unclear. And the government has perhaps made its job more difficult by treating all strikes as the same, as opposed to picking off those that they seem to be manageable. But it is tricky. The NHS is calling for a 20% pay increase. That will not have the inflationary effect that the British government claims that it will. That does not matter for inflation if nurses have an overdue pay rise. But nonetheless, it's they've drawn a political line in the sand, and it's no one yet knows who's going to blink first. That's the situation over here.
Thanks so much, Steve. So moving forward, like the question now is probably how to basically advance in the direction that you have all pointed out. So I'm really curious, Rose. I mean, your assessment was positive, but I think you ended mentioning that like there's still work to be done. I understand that not only that, probably like the balances of power have changed in the past weeks with basically the House falling in Republican hands, which it is already in some way transforming the Inflation Reduction Act as it was initially conceived. So yeah, now given this balance of power where the Republicans have the House, but the Democrats still have the Senate, and of course the executive, what is the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that you started with that, because I think that is so important and something quite unique to the US. Like, I would love to think about other actions Congress will take up, but like, I'm being realistic here. Like, that's just not going to happen. The makeup of the House has changed, and we're not going to really be able to get much done bipartisanly. While I would love them to do reforms on childcare, you know, a long, expensive, essential, something that has been crippling mothers for a very long time and has had very adverse impacts on mothers' labor force participation rates, that's not going to happen. Again, while some of the participants were talking about like direct relief measures to households, we're not going to have anything like that, I don't think, on top of, just the traditional automatic stabilizers. So thinking realistically, the two ways forward for us really are implementation of the bills that Congress has already passed. So there were 3 major bills. It was like the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Chips and Science Act, which was trying to boost our production of chips domestically, and then also the Inflation Reduction Act. And taken together, all those 3 bills really focus on shoring up America's independence, so that we're no longer reliant on anti-democratic countries for essentials. And so we're mostly focused on how do we implement those bills so that they deliver on their promise and intent, but also do so equitably. A big part of those bills that sometimes gets missed is it's not just about reducing cost or making America independent and resilient, but it's also creating a lot of jobs. So the Inflation Reduction Act is expected to create at least 1.5 million jobs. And there's a lot of things in that bill to make sure those jobs are good jobs, you know, have good wages, have protections in terms of safety and whatnot. And so a big part of the way we're thinking about this is we want to make sure that those jobs that get created, they're good jobs and they're available to all workers. And so we're really thinking about how do we make sure people traditionally left out of, say, the clean energy industry get those jobs? The second thing I'm thinking a lot about is, unsurprisingly, the Federal Reserve. You know, what is the Federal Reserve's interest rate hike? What are those impacts going to be on the real economy? I usually come at things from the labor market perspective. And yesterday, when the Federal Reserve, you know, announced their latest interest rate hike, they also released projections. And the first thing I did was looked at what they were forecasting for GDP and the unemployment rate. And unsurprisingly, they forecasted an unemployment rate that was slightly higher than their prior forecast, and it was something like 4.6% for next year. Something that is particularly unique to the US is, you know, like a headline unemployment rate of 4.6% seems somewhat low compared to historic recessions, right? Not that we're in a recession and we don't think we're going to enter one, but a 4.6% unemployment rate is quite low. However, in the US, there are systemic inequities that a 4.6% unemployment rate really masks the experiences of, for example, Black workers, whose unemployment rates are usually twice as high as that headline unemployment rate. So a 4.6% headline unemployment rate would mean an unemployment rate for Black workers of about 9%. If that was the headline unemployment rate, we would have been in crisis, right? So something we're thinking a lot about is, what are we going to do with the, you know, workers who are usually first fired and last hired, workers of color, people with a disability, those without a college degree? You know, the Federal Reserve's blunt tool of raising interest rates will have disproportionate impacts on those people. And at the same time, they're the very people who are hardest hit by the inflationary crisis. So we're focused on implementing the bills. Given what we're dealing with Congress, some of our action will be mostly on the state level where we can. We've got some favorable legislatures who may pass some cost of living relief, but also keeping a very close eye on what's the Federal Reserve's actions going to be in 2023. A lot of the impacts of interest rates that they've done so far haven't actually come through. So I'm cautious to what 2023 is going to be, particularly for the, you know, most vulnerable people.
Thanks so much, Rose. Yeah, this is definitely something that is very counterintuitive, I think, for all Europeans when we read those reports from the Fed that, to some extent, suggest that it would not be bad for the economy to in some way untighten the labor market in the US, when we have, at least in Southern Europe, like a problem which is completely the opposite. So thanks so much for this explanation, and perhaps these are some topics that we can later discuss with our four panelists. Marc-Olivier, I think ended explaining that there is still work to be done, given that in Europe, like, it is mainly an energy shock price shock, and of course France has the recent experience of the yellow vests that, in terms of political economy, could explain to some extent the level of let's say policies that have been basically targeting these decision fronts. I'm curious to hear what's the way forward. What are the expectations from Macron's administration, and what Terranova, for instance, is trying to push for in this context of crisis, and I mean both energy crisis and of course the beginning of perhaps what could be a recession.
Yes, I think there are three perspectives. The first one is to maintain direct relief measures on households, but as I said, more targeted. So in 2023, there will be the tariff shield will be replaced by energy vouchers for very specific households. So that's a good policy because you can really target households. The limit of it's not automatic, whereas the tariff shield, covers everybody automatically. So as I understand it, there is a risk that households do not ask for what they can ask for. The second perspective,
Marc-Olivier, so you're talking about like a non-take-up issue, right? Here,
that's it. Yeah, correct. The second perspective is about Europe. It's European negotiations. on joint gas purchases. I think that's on a good way. And then on price cap, and that's more difficult. There was yesterday, I think, meeting of energy ministers, and they did not come to any agreement. You must have it in mind that Norway, which is a huge provider of Europe, is making big money in this moment. So that's difficult, and there has been tension also between France and Germany because of the package, the German package, which was surprisingly high to support household and companies, and that generated a bit tension across Europe. And the third perspective is to avoid any inflationary loop when wages grow and stimulate inflation, of course. So we made a paper on this because it's a huge discussion on the left, of course, because many people say, well, you have to give more to wages. But if you get into this loop, then you're really getting in trouble because it's very hard to get out of it. But we of course, we can fear in January, in February, strikes and demonstration. All the more if there is a pension reform coming at the same time, which would be quite disastrous, I think. So the problem is to give good anticipations to the households and companies so that people don't fear inflation too much. But this is more, a problem of political message, I think.
Thanks so much for this, Jorge. And how would you, suggest that Spain moves forward from here? Like, what is the focus right now of this administration, and what should they be more attentive to, especially for those that do not come from the Spanish from a Spanish context, like with the general elections a year away from now.
Right. I think that's the key consideration. I mean, there are two things that are similar to the scenario that Rose was depicting in the US, but for different reasons, right? So it's not that there's political gridlock, it's that 2023 is an electoral year. So Spain has municipal and regional elections in May, and then probably general elections at the end of the year, if not earlier, probably by the end of the year. So that means that in terms of the kind of stuff that you would like to see of like bipartisan agreements that were reached for some, the implementation of some of these measures, or especially for something like public administration reform, which would be useful in the context of absorbing the European funds, right, from Next Generation EU. That's not going to happen. Not this year, probably not next year either, with a degree of political polarization lately. But there are certain things that can be done. So also a bit like Rose was saying, in the Spanish case, there is, and I think this is common everywhere, but here it's even heightened. There's sort of a very clear discrepancy between some macro figures, right, in terms of even GDP growth and the strength of the labor market and job creation, which has been, surprisingly strong and has held on even as the growth slows down. I should add that even then, for Spain, the sort of perspective next year is a soft landing, unless the ECB keeps raising rates at a very fast rate, and it just did 2 hours ago by 50 basic points. But so for Spain, like for most EU countries, a lot of the issues at stake are decided at the EU level, right? So Marc was mentioning the possibility of joint gas purchases. This would definitely be a step forward, right? Price regulations at the EU level are complicated. They've tried this with sort of Russian oil, but in the context of the Ukraine war, we know from the recent meeting that there are important reticencies from Germany, from the Dutch too. So, I hope that the needle moves further in the direction of regulating some of these prices temporarily, right? I think in the context of the crisis that we're facing right now, as I mentioned before, this is a measure that makes certain sense, certainly more than raising rates indefinitely, right? As your main tool to combat inflation. There's also the question, and this for Spain is relatively important, well, very important actually, of reforming the EU's fiscal rules, right? So the rules were suspended in the context of the COVID crisis, and the extension was furthered, again, because of the Ukraine crisis, and the idea is that they have to be reformed, and the Commission has laid out a proposal that I think moves in the right direction in terms of flexibilizing some of these measures and the time horizons that are given to member states to seek an adjustment path. It's just that, you know, there's a very good reform for maybe 10 or 15 years ago right now, right? With some of the current crises that we're facing in terms of in energy markets, in realizing that security and defense is a European public good that we should probably provide together in a coordinated way. These rules don't really offer significant leeway or as much as could be expected, but hopefully that reform passes through. You know, the Commission's guidelines are more or less followed, and no, you know, and these laws are successfully reformed. This would be an important step forward. And finally, I think, you know, on the question, and this is sort of you know, I guess the contrary of a silver lining. I was mentioning before that Spain has been successful with this price cap on gas, but I think part of the story that needs to be told too is that really we haven't faced a wage price spiral like you would imagine in a typically inflationary context, right? So it's important to mention we really are not in the 1970s. We don't have double-digit inflation in most European countries. We don't have a wage price spiral. In fact, in Spain, in this case, for example, wage devaluation is somewhere between 5 and 7%. So wages have taken a downward adjustment, and they've taken a strong hit throughout the year, right? It's just that, you know, that mechanism of adjustment is perhaps not as painful as wage devaluation as in the austerity crisis, but it's still a problem, and it really needs to be addressed. You know, ideally you'd have sort of a labor pact, you know, between labor, between business organizations, with the government overseeing it to index wages with, you know, keeping a bracket so that they don't contribute to inflation. But this has not been managed in the current context. I mean, it is a case in Spain where really like political tension and the electoral cycle gets in the way of doing things that would be useful for the whole of the economy.
Thanks so much, Jorge. And Rose had to leave us, as Arnaud just texted in the chat. But if anyone's interested in posing any questions, she left her email, so feel free to reach out. We're very thankful for her participation. So, Steve, before we move on to the final 10 minutes Q&A, what do you think that the UK should be focusing on right now? What is, in some way, the missing element of the response to the cost of living crisis?
Well, I think so. Something very interesting happened in the past 2 weeks. Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister, Labour, led this commission of the Labour Party to address the challenges that the UK is facing and come up with a new policy program for Labour. And the cost of living crisis didn't really make it into this agenda, which is rather remarkable. To the extent that it was covered, the recommendation was for more devolution, which is the UK speak for devolving or transferring greater authority to be it the nations themselves, so Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, or separately, to local policymakers. I think that's sort of goes without saying, but this is not a solution to a cost of living crisis. But I think that's important, and the reason why I started with that is because there's no real evident solution. And the reason for that is because what we're experiencing in this country is very much the accumulation of a large number of past policy mistakes. Brexit certainly plays a role in this. There's a reason why the United Kingdom had the sharpest recession in the G7s, had the slowest exit from the COVID recession. There's a reason why inflation, it's nice to hear about this rather tame inflation in other parts of the world. There's a reason why we're looking at, 11% year-on-year inflation numbers in the UK. There has been a remarkable lack of investment in domestic energy production over the past 40 years. The supply side, I share the point of view that Jorge has raised on the need for non-monetary adjustments in order to address dislocations in the real economy. The challenge that we're seeing in the United Kingdom on the supply side measure is almost it's almost a political stunt, I would say. This government and the past one, the one before that, has been issuing new permits for oil drilling in the North Sea. And the reason why I call that a stunt is because everybody knows, it goes without saying, that this will be wrapped up in legal troubles. So it does nothing. And of course, you know, the oil markets do have a curve, and that if you can bring down expectations of futures, then you can actually adjust prices today. We are looking at, if the litigation is unsuccessful, which it almost certainly will not be, this isn't coming online for many years, new oil production in the United Kingdom. So there's no sober, serious response to the cost of living crisis in this country on the supply side front. I would say, frankly, the fiscal response of providing relief to the lowest income households, that's fine. That's not bad. I don't see any meaningful inflationary effect of providing budget relief to 11 million people, or however many, I think it's 11 million qualify for the relief that's coming out. There's no inflationary effect of that. The trouble that we have seen is this fiscal monetary coordination. And that was what came up 2 months ago here. And I think that the United Kingdom is actually an interesting testing zone to solve this, because this concept of central bank independence, which is a contemporary fiction of the past 40 years, but that hasn't really been explored as thoroughly in the United Kingdom. That's not something that's never really been a critical part of the UK's macroeconomic policy landscape. It has become one in the past 30 years, but it's rather easy to undo it. And I was interested to see something today from Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so effectively the Finance Minister, Secretary of the Treasury here, came out and said that we need to move in lockstep with the Bank of England. Lockstep is not the same thing as saying coordination. But for those of you who saw or remember, 2 months ago, there was this problem where the government at the time, the Truss government, came out and said that they were going to provide this unfunded energy price cap. By unfunded, I mean without raising taxes to offset it, which meant that the government was going to issue a lot more debt the government being not the central bank, at the same time that the central bank was selling government debt, was selling UK gilts. And the problem that you had there was that there was going to be a large glut of gilts on the market. So as a result, prices collapsed, yields spiked, the currency sold off. And that was, without the shadow of a doubt, the fault of an inexperienced government at the time. But it did spark an question, which was, can we actually perhaps do fiscal policy, loose fiscal policy at the same time as tight monetary policy, and coordinate it in a way that could offset or at least sterilize some of the clear contradictions of that? I don't know if that has an evident solution, coming up with a new monetary policy framework that can sort of address two different goals at once. But it's certainly worth exploring in this country, because there's no other viable option. I mean, they've boxed themselves into a corner of it's not an exaggeration to say now it's stagflation. We've had 2 consecutive months of inflation. We've had 4 consecutive months, or more than that, of inflation. We've had 4 consecutive months now of recession. We're in a stagflationary environment that'll continue for another year. Is there a monetary policy framework that hasn't been considered? If I were at the Bank of England, I'd be asking that question, because the conventional solutions are not large enough or sophisticated enough to deal with the problems that the UK has made for itself.
Thanks so much, Steve, for this explanation. So we have a bit less than 10 minutes left, so we perhaps can address some of the questions that the participants have been posing in the Q&A. We have many, but I think we could take 2 of them that I think are very well tied to each other, which is on the one hand, what is the role that unions have had in this crisis? How influential have they been? Because I think that's something that many political economists, such as Adam Tooze, have insisted on the differences between the late 1970s and today's inflation, is that the role and the power of unions have been quite different, right? And that has a lot to do with the sort of price wage spirals that we have not clearly seen in this context. So perhaps we can answer that question together with that of what are the long-term effects of rising interest rates? Are they desirable, or the long-term effects of raising interest rates might be counterproductive? So I think that because these two questions are pretty much tied together, perhaps like we can do a round asking Marc-Olivier, Jorge, and Steve, what has been the influence of unions in your countries, and what are the sort of perhaps unintended consequences of these raising interest rates that we could see in the coming months?
Do you want me to start?
Perhaps that's fine, yeah. But we can.
Well, really briefly, I think the role of unions was very small in the French context, as you mentioned earlier. It's rather a kind of yellow jackets movement that the government fears, because unions do not really have any control on this kind of demonstrations. And as we saw in the last years, they are less and less able to negotiate and to have good results for wages, for example. So they were not really active at the time. So that's my first answer. And interest rates, I'm not really a specialist in that matter, but I think that if we want to avoid any inflationary spiral, we have to raise the interest rates. But of course, there's a huge political and social cost to it. And so we also have to find ways to deal with this at the same time. That's it.
Thanks so much, Marc-Olivier. Jorge, perhaps you can go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree that sort of this, I mean, the immediate question, what are labor unions doing in Spain? I mean, that's answered pretty quickly. They haven't been a significant actor in the last year or so. And so like labor unrest has not been really an issue. And that's part of the problem in terms of like the wage devaluation, right? That as you mentioned, labor is not in a structural position like it was in the 1970s to demand, higher wages that, at least makes inflation more bearable, although it of course can make it more entrenched. So that's part of the story. Then I think the question really is what Stephen was mentioning before is, I do think that, rates had to go up sooner or later, and a tightening of monetary policy was overdue, in that like you can't just provide these extraordinary liquidity measures that we've been relying on for the last 10 years without eventually generating asset bubbles of all kinds, or other kinds of distortions in the economy. So that's understandable, but the question is, how far do you want to go, and to what extent do you want to risk the economic recovery? And really understanding that in the European context, they are a necessary but very limited tool to contain inflation. So the question is, in many ways, okay, during the COVID crisis, we had loose monetary and fiscal policies. Everyone understood that was needed in the context of an emergency. Before the COVID crisis, in Europe at least, we had very loose monetary policy and tight fiscal policies, right? That was the whole idea. And so now we have the opposite mismatch, where monetary policy is expected to tighten, but fiscal policy should not, not yet at least. You should still keep in redistributive measures to shield the more vulnerable collectives and workers and whatnot from the effects of the ongoing crisis. And that's a very hard line to manage. And I really don't have I don't think there's a single answer to how to strike that balance, right? You obviously need to consider non-monetary measures to combat inflation. You need to, like, governments need to consider that, yes, the extraordinary fiscal measures that we're taking in the last 2 years, you will eventually have to lower the dial on those, but you have to do it very gradually. So, I think it's a situation where, new policies like the ones we're mentioning before are welcome. It is a good time for policy innovation, but it is also one where you need to strike a careful mix of policies, and there's not a right, one size fits all solution that will allow you to just navigate the following year without any sort of tensions.
And perhaps, like, Steve, we can hear your concluding remarks, because I think that after that we'll probably run out of time. So yeah, what's your view on this?
So yeah, similar view on the unions. I think that one of the more important theories to be bearing in mind when thinking through all this is how unlikely it was for inflation to emerge, and go back and look at Larry Summers' early work on secular stagnation. And one of the core points there was that it was the weakening of the unions over the past 4 decades that had put us into such a strong disinflationary environment. And this has the bout of inflation we've seen for the past year. We should really be comfortable saying it has happened despite the fact that the breaking of the back of the unions has been such a disinflationary activity. Similar situation in the United Kingdom, certainly. And I don't think, again, that bowing to union pressure on wage increases would really affect the situation. We're looking at largely inflation coming in through food and energy, and then through the secondary effects of that. But on the long-term effect of raising interest rates, I would say the important point today is just how rate sensitive of a global economy we are. To varying degrees in different places, but when you have interest rates very low for 40 years, and then certainly for the past 2 years, and certainly also for the past 15 years, leverage increases quite a bit. People start borrowing a lot more. And when leverage increases, people become substantially more vulnerable to adjustments in the cost of that leverage and borrowing costs. And what we're currently experiencing is borrowing costs rising rapidly, that's interest rates, and things start to break. And I think that we are seeing things start to break if people are paying attention to what's happening in some of the more speculative corners of the financial economy, tech, crypto, etc. That's starting to break. There's some schadenfreude in watching that, but I don't think that we should get too excited about this because it's not happening in a structured or regulated. It doesn't need to be regulated. It's not happening in a structured or strategic manner. It's just breaking. We don't quite know what will be next. We hope that there's no subprime mortgage market that's going to burst, but it is quite possible that there's something in the residential economy that could break as a result of rising interest rates. So we hope that doesn't necessarily happen. That said, am I wedded to the concept of low interest rates permanently? Not really. I think that one of the other prevailing theories of the past 20, 30 years was the liquidity trap and the difficulty of stimulating growth when you're already at the zero lower bound. And we've had interest rates right next to the zero lower bound for the past 2 decades, on and off at various points, since really the financial crisis. If we were able to build more room into our monetary policy framework, which is to say, if we get interest rates up high enough that we can then bring them back down when we need them, then we're in a bit of a better place. Because right now, when we want to stimulate growth, really, we don't just cut interest rates. We start going out and doing asset purchases. And that's the thing that starts building up these weird financial asset bubbles. So, I mean, I see as a purely conceptual matter a long-term benefit to rising interest rates. I think that the way you get there to the point where monetary policy becomes a conventional tool of the late 20th century again, the way you get there is a very, very bumpy and perilous road. The way you get there is potentially by not just, just happening upon crypto frauds, but actually inducing bursts in otherwise normal, healthy, robust corners of the economy. And that's something that I'd be relatively cautious of. So I don't mind that people push back on central banks and say, slow down, because we do need to worry about the second order effects of rising rates at the moment.
Thanks so much, Stephen. I think that sadly we've run out of time. We had many questions in the Q&A section. Thanks to all participants for participating actively, but we're sorry we cannot answer all of them. We wish that we ran out of time. And thanks so much to our 4 panelists, Marc-Olivier, Steve, Jorge, and Rose, who had to leave. It's been an absolute privilege to learn in just an hour all the key takeaways from these 4 cases from the US, the UK, France, and Spain. It's been fascinating. So thank you so much for taking the time and for letting us learn from these from some of the experts and experts coming from probably like some of the most influential think tanks in their own country. So once again, thanks so much for taking the time. And thanks also to Professor Kurz and to Montclair University for hosting us and hosting this event. Thanks so much for making this possible. And thanks everyone for coming. It's been a privilege to learn from you. This event will be uploaded at some point. So if you want to go back and like revisit some of the points made in this panel, like you'll probably be able to do that in a few days. So once again, thank you all.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. Be well. Happy holidays with your loved ones and families. It was great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.